Sometime in the second week of July 2026, a network of GPS ground sensors planted across the Pacific Northwest began recording something that seismologists at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network had been quietly watching for. Not a rupture. Not a headline earthquake that would have rattled windows in Portland or sent alerts to every phone in Seattle. What the instruments picked up was slower than that, and in some ways far more significant. A measurable and unusually extended pattern of deep tremor, slow ground movement, and accelerated plate deformation along a fault system that runs nearly 1,000 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean floor off the North American coastline. A fault system that has not fully ruptured in over 300 years, and one that scientists have been warning, with increasing urgency, is building toward an earthquake that would be unlike anything the modern United States has ever experienced. This is what the monitoring data actually shows. What researchers at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, Oregon State University, and the United States Geological Survey have confirmed and publicly addressed in the days since the readings came in. No exaggeration required. Because when you understand what the Cascadia Subduction Zone truly is, what it has already done in the geologically recent past, and what the combination of signals recorded this month is now telling the scientific community, the confirmed picture alone is enough to make every emergency management director from Eureka, California to Victoria, British Columbia take a long, hard look at the plans they have in place and honestly ask whether they are ready. The event at the center of the latest scientific concern is called an episodic tremor and slip episode, ETS in the shorthand that geologists use. Most people who live in the Pacific Northwest have never heard of it. That gap is itself part of the problem. In the deeper portions of the Cascadia Fault, below the locked zone where the Juan de Fuca plate is grinding against the North American plate and building up centuries of elastic strain, there are transition zones where the plates don't lock rigidly but instead slip slowly, episodically, releasing stress in a subtle pattern of tremors and ground motion that is too gradual and too deep to be felt at the surface. GPS stations operated by the EarthScope Consortium, a university-run network of precision instruments embedded across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, record these episodes with high accuracy. ETS events along the central portion of Cascadia have been occurring on a fairly predictable cycle of roughly 12 to 14 months, and for years, the working assumption was that they represented a relatively routine mechanical process in the deeper fault, not a safety valve exactly, but a normal expression of the plate boundary's ongoing mechanics. The July 2026 episode changed the comfort of that assumption. What the EarthScope GPS stations recorded this month was not a typical Central Zone ETS event. The tremor extended noticeably into the southern section of the fault, the stretch running offshore of northern California and southern Oregon, and it lasted significantly longer than historical averages for that segment. Harold Tobin, director of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington, confirmed in a public statement that the episode was among the more anomalous readings his team had logged in the southern portion of the zone. Anomalous, he was careful to note, does not mean imminent collapse. Scientists do not use words like that carelessly. But anomalous on the southern segment of Cascadia is not a detail to set aside, because the southern segment carries its own history, and that history is the part of this story that requires sitting with. Chris Goldfinger, a marine geologist at Oregon State University who has spent decades drilling into the seafloor off the Pacific Northwest coast and pulling up sediment cores from the bottom of the Pacific, has documented something that fundamentally changed the way seismologists understand Cascadia's behavior. His research, published across multiple peer-reviewed papers and now considered a cornerstone of Pacific Northwest earthquake science, revealed that the full Cascadia zone does not behave as a single uniform fault. The northern end, running offshore of Washington State and British Columbia, ruptures only in the large full-zone events that occur roughly every 500 years. But the southern segment, the stretch off southern Oregon and northern California, ruptures far more frequently on its own, independently, without the northern end participating. Goldfinger's core data puts the southern segment's independent recurrence interval at somewhere between 200 and 250 years. The last time the entire zone ruptured together was January 26, 1700, 326 years ago. The southern segment, with its shorter independent cycle, has not produced a major event in that entire interval. By the numbers embedded in Goldfinger's paleoseismic record, the southern portion of Cascadia is not approaching its window. It is inside it, and has been for some time. No seismologist will give you a date. No instrument exists, and no algorithm has been built that can predict the specific hour or week or even decade of the next Cascadia rupture with the kind of precision people want when they ask whether they should move. That is not how earthquake science works, and anyone claiming otherwise is not doing earthquake science. What the models provide instead are probability windows based on recurrence intervals, elapsed time since the last event, and current strain accumulation data. The USGS's most recent estimates for a major rupture in the southern Cascadia segment put the probability at roughly 40% within the next 50 years. 50 years sounds like a distant horizon until you put it next to the GPS readings confirmed this month. Readings that show the locked zone of the fault is continuing to accumulate strain exactly as the models projected, with no signs of the slow creep that sometimes bleeds off stress and reduces the pressure building in the locked interface. The fault is doing what the models said it would do. The July ETS event is the latest data point in a pattern that has been consistent for decades, and the pattern says the pressure is still building. Here is the part of this story that scientists want the public to hold on to, not out of panic, but out of honest reckoning. The July episode was also accompanied by an increase in what the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network calls low-frequency earthquakes, or LFEs. Tiny, slow-rupturing seismic events that occur at the deep transition between the fully locked and freely slipping portions of the fault. On their own, LFEs are not dangerous. They are a natural part of the fault's deep mechanics. But the geographic distribution of the LFEs detected during this month's episode was shifted southward compared to the pattern observed during recent ETS cycles, overlapping with a portion of the fault that Goldfinger's sediment core data links specifically to the most frequent independent southern segment ruptures. Seismologists are not calling this a direct precursor. That word carries a precision that the science does not currently support. What they are saying is that the signal is unusual, that it is consistent with a fault segment under elevated strain, and that it deserves more serious public attention than it has received. To understand what a Cascadia rupture would actually mean for the people living above it, you have to set aside the frame of reference that most Americans carry for earthquakes, because the Cascadia event that the models describe is not a 30-second California shake followed by cracked plaster and toppled bookshelves. A full-zone megathrust rupture along Cascadia would produce sustained violent ground motion lasting somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes is not an abstraction. It is long enough for a person to wonder, in real time, whether it will ever stop. It is long enough for structures that might survive a short-duration earthquake to accumulate enough cumulative stress cycling in their frames and foundations that they fail progressively from the inside. The building stock of the Pacific Northwest is deeply unequal in its ability to absorb that kind of sustained loading. Older reinforced concrete buildings, the kind that make up much of downtown Portland's commercial core and significant portions of older Seattle neighborhoods, have been identified in multiple engineering studies as among the most vulnerable to extended shaking. Soft-story apartment buildings, common throughout Eugene, Tacoma, and the neighborhoods surrounding both Seattle and Portland, where ground floor parking creates an inherently weak lower level, represent a mass casualty risk that city inventories have documented but that retrofitting programs have only partially addressed. The shaking is not the worst part. The Juan de Fuca plate suddenly sliding beneath the North American plate in a megathrust rupture would not just produce seismic waves. It would physically displace the seafloor across an enormous area. That displacement would push a massive volume of water upward and generate a tsunami propagating outward from the fault in every direction. For the Pacific Northwest coast, that propagation time is the number that defines the scale of the threat. And it is a number that most residents of Oregon and Washington coastal communities have not internalized. A Cascadia tsunami would reach the Oregon coast in approximately 15 to 30 minutes after the shaking stops. In some locations, closer estimates put first wave arrival at 10 minutes or less. The residents of Seaside, Cannon Beach, Manzanita, Astoria, and Ocean Shores would have a window that is shorter than the average American lunch break to reach ground that is high enough to survive what is coming. FEMA's modeling, published in 2013 and refined in subsequent years, projected that a full Cascadia rupture could kill more than 13,000 people, injure over 27,000, and displace nearly 1 million from their homes. Those numbers assume some functioning warning infrastructure and some degree of community preparedness. For the coastal communities where tsunami evacuation towers remain unbuilt, and where residents have never practiced an actual evacuation route, the numbers could be substantially higher. There is a dimension of the Cascadia tsunami risk that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, but that emergency managers find particularly sobering. The most catastrophic tsunami in recent American memory, the waves generated by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, gave coastal communities along the Pacific Northwest hours of warning because the source was on the other side of the ocean. A Chilean earthquake generates a Pacific crossing tsunami that activates the whole international warning network, gives scientists time to calculate wave heights, and gives coastal communities time to evacuate. A Cascadia rupture is a near-source event. The fault is directly offshore. The warning window that the NOAA, National Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska can provide is real and functional, but it is measured in minutes, not hours. The warning system is designed to alert. The evacuation itself is a local problem, a land use problem, a community infrastructure problem that no federal agency can solve from a distance and no warning siren can substitute for if the roads and towers and drills are not already in place. Let's stay with the geology a moment longer, because the mechanics of what makes Cascadia capable of producing an event of this scale are genuinely worth understanding, and they are not complicated once the geometry is clear. Subduction zones are the locations on Earth's surface where one tectonic plate is driven beneath another. The Juan de Fuca plate, a relatively small oceanic plate, is being pushed eastward by seafloor spreading at the Juan de Fuca ridge off the Pacific coast, and as it travels east, it collides with the continental edge of North America and slides beneath it. The rate of subduction is roughly 40 millimeters per year, barely perceptible in human time, vast in geological terms. The contact surface between the two plates, the megathrust, is not smooth. It is rough and irregular at every scale, and the two plates lock together at their interface, storing elastic strain in the surrounding rock the way a compressed spring stores energy. That locked zone along Cascadia is enormous. It spans roughly 100 kilometers in width from the coastline outward and runs the full 1,000-mile length of the fault. Every year that the plates don't slip, that stored energy grows. When the locked zone finally releases, it doesn't release gradually. It slips by meters, sometimes by 10 meters or more in a single event, in a cascading rupture that propagates along the fault at roughly 1 kilometer per second. The ground above it does not simply shake, it heaves. The coastline physically drops. Geologists measuring the effects of past Cascadia ruptures in the soil and sediment record along the Oregon and Washington coasts have documented sudden land subsidence of up to 2 meters during individual events, meaning stretches of coastal land that currently sit above the tide line would be permanently below it within seconds of a full rupture, before the tsunami even arrives. That is not a projection. That is what has already happened here, repeatedly, in the sediment record that scientists have spent decades learning to read. The sediment record is where Brian Atwater, a USGS geologist, found the first physical proof of Cascadia's megaquake history in the late 1980s. Not in seismograph readings or modern instruments, but in stands of dead cedar and spruce buried in the tidal marshes of coastal Washington. Ghost forests, they are called. Trees killed instantly when the land they stood on dropped below the waterline during the 1700 Cascadia rupture. Atwater's carbon dating of those buried tree rings, and the subsequent radiocarbon and dendrochronology work that followed, confirmed that the Pacific Northwest coastline has experienced sudden, violent land drops, the signature of megathrust ruptures, at least 6 times in the past 3,000 years. That documentation, published in peer-reviewed literature and confirmed repeatedly since, established Cascadia as one of the most dangerous fault systems on the planet. What makes the 40 years since Atwater's discovery particularly striking is how little the pace of preparation has matched the pace of the science. There is a detail from the paleoseismic record that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Goldfinger's sediment cores did not just confirm that Cascadia produces megathrust events. They revealed that the ruptures vary significantly in which segments participate. Some past events involved only the southern half. Others ran the full length of the zone. A subset appear to have included a segment that sat out the previous rupture and therefore had been accumulating strain for 2 full cycles rather than 1, releasing extra energy that the models suggest produced unusually large ground motion in specific geographic areas. The fault has a memory. Its behavior in any given event is influenced by what did and did not release in the events before it. The current configuration, with the southern segment showing anomalous tremor behavior and extended elapsed time since the last independent southern rupture, and GPS data confirming continued strain accumulation, is being read by the scientific community against that historical template. The international dimension of Cascadia's threat is one that Americans rarely consider, partly because the geography makes the Pacific Northwest feel geographically isolated from the rest of the world's earthquake experience. It is not. The 1700 Cascadia rupture generated a tsunami that crossed the entire Pacific Ocean and struck the coastline of Japan within roughly 10 hours of the rupture, killing hundreds of people in coastal villages along the Japanese coast and leaving records in the historical documents of the Edo period that allowed scientists in the 20th century to calculate the precise date of an event that occurred before European settlement of the Pacific Northwest. Japan was keeping records of a North American earthquake before North America knew it had fault systems. That historical connection carries its own kind of weight, and the contrast between how Japan has treated the knowledge of tsunamigenic subduction zones in the centuries since, and how the Pacific Northwest has treated the knowledge it has had for 40 years, is one of the most uncomfortable comparisons in modern disaster preparedness. The comparison is not abstract. Japan sits atop active subduction zones, experiences major earthquakes within living memory on a recurring basis, and has invested in building codes, evacuation infrastructure, community drilling, and early warning systems at a scale that reflects a nation that has been broken by tsunamis before and chose to build back differently. The Shinkansen bullet train network halts automatically when seismic sensors detect ground motion above a threshold, not because a human operator makes that call, but because the decision has already been made in advance and built into the infrastructure. Japanese schoolchildren practice earthquake drills with the same regularity that American children practice fire drills. Coastal communities have built vertical evacuation towers, reinforced concrete structures designed to remain standing through a major tsunami and accessible within minutes of shaking. That gives residents a survival option when running to high ground is not possible in the available time. The Pacific Northwest has some of this. Seaside, Oregon, where the entire downtown occupies a flat coastal plain with hills, a meaningful distance away, currently has a small number of these structures for a population of roughly 7,000 people. The Oregon Department of Emergency Management has programs to expand that number. The pace of that expansion has not matched what the geological data says the timeline demands. There is a further layer to this that the July ETS readings have brought back into focus, one that sits beyond the fault itself and involves the volcanic landscape that sits directly above the subduction zone. The Cascade Range, the chain of volcanoes that runs from Lassen Peak in Northern California through Mount Shasta, Crater Lake, the Three Sisters, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Rainier to the Canadian border, exists specifically because the Juan de Fuca plate is sliding beneath the North American plate and releasing water into the overlying mantle rock as it sinks deeper, lowering the melting point of that rock and generating the magma that feeds every Cascade volcano. The subduction zone that produces Cascadia earthquakes and the volcanic system that built the mountains visible from Portland and Seattle are the same machine operating at different depths. A major Cascadia rupture would not automatically trigger a volcanic eruption. The relationship between large thrust earthquakes and volcanic systems is probabilistic rather than deterministic, and most megathrust events globally do not produce immediate volcanic responses. But the USGS Cascade Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington, which monitors the Cascades continuously, explicitly includes post-earthquake volcanic surveillance in its protocols following any major Cascadia seismic activity. Mount Rainier, which the USGS identifies as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the country specifically because of its proximity to the greater Seattle and Tacoma metropolitan area and its enormous volcanic edifice of ice and unstable rock, is among the volcanoes that scientists watch most carefully in the aftermath of significant fault activity along the subduction zone. The July ETS episode alone does not elevate that concern to a new level. But the interconnected nature of the system is a reminder that in the Pacific Northwest, these hazards do not exist in separate compartments. What is actually being done in response to the July monitoring data, and honestly, in response to decades of accumulated scientific warning, is worth being clear-eyed about. The NOAA National Tsunami Warning Center operates around the clock and has direct communication links with every emergency management agency along the Pacific coast. The system works. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network's instruments are among the most sophisticated in the world for monitoring a subduction zone of this type. Washington State has a seismic safety committee that has been working on retrofit standards and bridge vulnerability assessments for years. Oregon passed legislation in 2019 establishing a resilience plan framework specifically designed around a Cascadia event, projecting infrastructure failure scenarios and establishing retrofit priorities. These are real efforts, and they are staffed by serious, capable people. The gap is not in the science, and it is not in the intent. The gap is in the pace and the scale of implementation relative to what the geological record says the risk actually is. The bridges along the Interstate 5 corridor, the main north-south artery connecting California, Oregon, and Washington, are a documented vulnerability. Multiple bridges along that corridor, including crossings of the Columbia River, have been assessed as likely to fail in a Cascadia megaquake. Retrofit timelines for some of those structures are measured in decades. The Oregon Resilience Plan's own projections suggest the I-5 corridor south of the Columbia River could be non-functional for weeks to months after a full Cascadia event. A region of several million people isolated from the supply chain for that duration is a humanitarian scenario that no amount of after-the-fact response can fully address if the preparation is not already in place. The people who live closest to the Cascadia coastline, in Seaside, in Cannon Beach, in the fishing communities along the southern Oregon coast, in the low-lying neighborhoods of Astoria that have stood where the Columbia River meets the Pacific for over 2 centuries, are the people for whom this month's readings carry the most immediate personal weight. Most of them have heard of Cascadia in the way that most Americans have heard of the San Andreas Fault, as a geological fact somewhere in the background of daily life, not as a concrete operational reality that shapes where they keep their emergency supplies and whether they have actually walked their evacuation route on foot. Emergency managers along the Oregon coast report steady improvement in public awareness since a widely read 2015 article in The New Yorker, written by Catherine Schultz entitled The Really Big One, brought Cascadia to national attention in a way that decades of scientific papers had not. That article won the Pulitzer Prize. It also, according to emergency management officials who lived through the response, triggered the closest thing to a sustained public conversation about Cascadia preparedness that the Pacific Northwest had seen in modern times. That conversation has continued, unevenly, in the years since. The July 2026 monitoring data is the latest reason it should not be allowed to fade again. Earthquakes cannot be predicted. That statement is as true today as it was when Atwater pulled his first ghost tree out of a Washington tidal marsh in the 1980s. No instrument combination, no machine learning model applied to seismic data, no animal behavior study will give the Pacific Northwest a week's warning before the Cascadia fault slips. What the science does provide, clearly, repeatedly, and with a level of confidence that the geological record fully supports, is a portrait of a fault system under sustained strain, in a region where the consequences of unpreparedness would be measured in thousands of lives. The July ETS readings will continue to be analyzed. The GPS stations will continue recording millimeter-scale ground deformation. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the USGS will continue publishing what the instruments show. Keep watching those updates. Keep watching the progress, or the absence of progress, on coastal evacuation infrastructure, bridge retrofits, and building code enforcement for older concrete structures in Portland and Seattle. And if you live anywhere within range of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, from the northernmost tip of California to the southern shore of Vancouver Island, take the geological record seriously. The fault has spoken many times before, in the rings of buried trees and the layers of offshore sediment, and the collapsed coastlines that are still visible if you know where to look. The only question that the July data leaves open is the same question it has always been. Not whether the fault will rupture again, whether the people living above it will be ready when it does.